Thank the member. I call the member for Hotham.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I rise to make a contribution to this year's Closing the Gap report, which was presented to the Australian Parliament by the Prime Minister about 2 weeks ago. Deputy Speaker, Australia can never be the country that it wants to be, a strong country, a truly multicultural country, a cohesive country, until we address this extraordinary national shame of the gap in life chances between Indigenous Australians and the rest of this country. It's simply not possible for us ever to reach that goal that so many Australians have for this country. Now, it's great to make a contribution to Closing the Gap, Deputy Speaker, because this policy itself, just the very act of saying that we are not going to stand still and we are not going to allow these gaps to continue, is a really, really important thing that the Australian government has done. And Deputy Speaker, it's absolutely extraordinary to me to think that before Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister, that no Australian Prime Minister had stood up before and said we must close this gap and we're going to set down targets and we're going to measure our progress so we can keep ourselves honest on this. So I want to say to the Abbott and Turnbull governments, for all of the faults and flaws in their Indigenous policy, I'm very grateful that they've maintained these Closing the Gap targets, because without them, this debate wouldn't be happening in the chamber right now. Australians wouldn't have the information that we have today about the direness of some of the statistics that came through in this report. And Deputy Speaker, most importantly, the Parliament would not be coming together to discuss this. One of the things that really bothers me as a Member of Parliament is that despite the professed keenness of interest from all sides of politics from many members of Parliament in this issue, it's actually something we hardly ever discuss in the National Parliament. And it's just a real source of pride for me to see that the Closing the Gap statement just of itself requires the Prime Minister of this country and the opposition leader of this country to stand before the Australian people and to take some ownership and some responsibility on the many, many problems we have in this area. Deputy Speaker, thinking about what we learned in the Close the Gap speech for this year was sobering again, and it has been sobering for every year that these targets have been in place. I want to start by talking about some of the things that are positive in the report and then some of the policy issues here, because too much in Indigenous policy we dwell on what a terrible problem this is without talking about the things that we can do about it, and there are lots of things we can do about it. So firstly, Deputy Speaker, it was really terrific to see 2 of the 7 major Closing the Gap targets that Australia is on track to meet those. The first of those is child mortality, such an important one. All we're saying here is that Indigenous babies should have the same chance of getting to their first birthday as babies who are born of families of different origin. A pretty straightforward thing, and I'm so pleased to see that we are progressing on that gap. In Year 12 attainment, Deputy Speaker, we see the same thing. We're seeing slow progress for sure, but we are making gains there. But Deputy Speaker, that's really the best of it, because when we look to the other areas of Indigenous disadvantage, we see that we're just not making the progress that those targets, some may describe them as ambitious, I wouldn't. Halving the gap in life expectancy between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians shouldn't be too much to ask, but it seems that is too much to ask of our policy environment today. So when we look at some really fundamental things, the access Indigenous children have to early learning, the access that Indigenous people have to the health services that they need to maintain a good life expectancy. And one thing that's quite important, Deputy Speaker, I know to all sides of politics, is that we are not making the progress we want on Indigenous employment. And I think that most people agree that the pathway to a lot of other improvements for the lives of Indigenous people is to make sure that Indigenous Australians have equal access to jobs. And today we're failing on that. Deputy Speaker, one of the things that Labor has tried to highlight in the Closing the Gap speeches over the last 2 years has been the importance of including a justice target in the Closing the Gap targets. What that really means is that we see shocking differences in the rates of incarceration of Indigenous Australians and non-Indigenous Australians. Deputy Speaker, Indigenous Australians are somewhere around 3% of the Australian population, but they are 27% of our prison population. And Deputy Speaker, it gets even more gutting because half of those Indigenous people who are in jail today are under the age of 30. Now this is shocking. It's shocking, and it's related to every other of these indicators. How can we get life expectancy outcomes that we want when there are so many Indigenous young people wasting years of their life in jail? It's simply not good enough. And one of the things that Labor has proposed in response to this very clear need for us to introduce a new target is just to say, let's just include this in closing the gap, so it's something that we track and monitor with the same vigilance that we look at these other key things like life expectancy and child mortality. Deputy Speaker, there are some other really important things that Labor wants to do in this area. One of the things I was really proud to hear Bill Shorten, the opposition leader, announce on the Closing the Gap speeches was that there will be an additional $9 million committed to trachoma treatment for Indigenous Australians. We know that Indigenous people, on top of all these other issues, are 6 times more likely to be blind than Australians who come from other backgrounds. It's not good enough, and something like eye disease, it needs money. It's actually that fundamental. We need doctors to be funded to go out to these communities and help Indigenous people get the eye services that they need. Deputy Speaker, something else that I was really proud of was to hear the opposition leader announce that Labor has set down a target date for the referendum, which will consider whether there should be constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians. I'm hugely in favour of this. I've spent some time living in North East Arnhem Land. I've spent quite a lot of time working on Indigenous communities. And despite seeing the very practical nature of the problems that are being faced by people in those communities, I do believe that these big picture reconciliation things really matter. We can't fix more than 200 years of violence and dispossession just through improvements to government services. There is a deep wound at the heart of this relationship, and it's not going to be fixed unless we see some real giving on the part of other Australians and some real sympathy and empathy in how we talk about Indigenous people and how we acknowledge them as our first Australians. So I'm really pleased to see that the opposition leader is putting his money where his mouth is, in a sense, and saying that we are going to work towards a date here, because we've been talking about constitutional recognition in this country for a long time, and it's time to do something about it. Deputy Speaker, I want to move away from Labor policy a little bit and just talk about some of the things that I think are really important in this area and that I'm hoping to work on in the time that I'm a Member of Parliament. Deputy Speaker, one of the things I really believe, having worked with Indigenous communities, is that we have to help Indigenous Australians have their own voice in this national conversation. And one of the things that really devastates me is the fact that ATSIC was shut down, so this was Indigenous self-government, was shut down quite a long time ago, and nothing has been built in its place. So what we have now is 3, 4, 5% of our population who are dispersed with such different interests, such different life experiences all over the country, but with no voice. And what we see happening as a result is that politicians can pick Indigenous leaders who are saying the things that they want to hear and anoint them as Indigenous leaders. And that's not good enough, Deputy Speaker. I think that Indigenous people need their own voice and their own right to their own democracy. And I do believe that means creating a structure that's similar to ATSIC. Deputy Speaker, we see problems with democracy in lots of other parts of our country. I know that in your state of New South Wales, we've seen a few issues there over recent years. But we don't shut down democracy. We don't take away people's right to be represented. And I'm really shocked that that's been allowed to happen to Indigenous Australians. We can't solve this problem without them being our true partners in this discussion. Deputy Speaker, I want to briefly mention the important role of Indigenous girls and women in this discussion. One of the things that's a guiding principle of our international development policy is that we invest in women and girls overseas, because women and girls are shown to use the additional resources they have to invest in the wealth and the health and welfare of their own children, and that grows their own community in a really positive way. Yet, Deputy Speaker, we haven't done the same thing for Indigenous women and girls, and this is an obvious place for us to improve. I'm pleased to see that Labor is supporting the STARS program, which is effectively like a Clontarf program, but for women and girls, and it's doing great things up in Darwin, and I really want to see that rolled out more across the country. Deputy Speaker, I want to say one more thing to ordinary Australians about this problem, and that is that government is not going to solve this problem unless you work with us to express your outrage and your utter unwillingness to accept the situation as it is today. Sometimes people in this parliament say, don't politicise Aboriginal issues, don't politicise Indigenous issues. Well, that's just ridiculous. This is a political problem. This is about who has power and resources in our community. And until the majority of Australians are willing to stand up with one voice and say we have to do better, we must do better, then this problem is not going to get resolved. So I want to encourage Australians to say, with me, this is not good enough, and I hope to see something better in next year's Closing the Gap speech.
I thank the member